Morning. It's Monday, November 9th. And as we all know, President-elect Biden won the election. But it's not over yet because President Trump is going to use every possible way to overturn the result. They are going to spend probably the entire 70 some odd days until January 20th trying to overturn the count. And Donald had said that he will concede after they have looked for all these mistakes. But I'm not so sure he actually will concede. But in any event, so far that's still on the table, that he will concede. They're looking for every little mistake that could have possibly happened. But the biggest mistake of all was made by President Trump. It was a monumental error. There are 239 million eligible voters in the United States. And in this election, we only had about 66% of them vote. Roughly somewhere between 145 million and 150 million when the counts will all be in. So that means that about 80 million votes were left on the table. Now, the 150 some odd million that voted is the largest turnout in my lifetime, and it's probably the largest turnout in many people's lifetime. Because we're a notoriously bad nation at voting. We vote about average of 50% of the people vote. Now, in this election, we are confronted with COVID-19, a pandemic, which caused us to create for the first time in many states the use of a mail-in ballot. So obviously you had, I don't know how many states that had never tried this before, and therefore, if you weren't careful, you would be susceptible to major mistakes or errors. Much to the chagrin of the president, he indicated that there could be monumental fraud if we had mail-in ballots. So for over 6 months during the run-up to the election, he constantly pounded about the fraud that was going to occur if we had mail-in ballots. He encouraged his voting public to vote in person, and they did. As you could see by the way the counts were coming in, he was leading in many, many states because his people had listened to him and voted in public. But how many of his people didn't vote at all because he pounded on the mail-in ballot situation? How many of his people preferred not to vote because they were afraid of the pandemic? And they had been told by their erstwhile president that mail-in would be a fraud. So maybe they didn't vote. So maybe he scared his people out of this election and cost himself the presidency. Maybe if he would have kept his mouth shut and said, vote any way you can. Be careful. Vote any way you can. When I went to vote, which was really just to drop off my absentee ballot, there were long, long lines of people waiting to vote. And they were waiting in a very civilized manner. Of course, they were standing on line for 2 or 3 hours. So I ask you, if you had seen that, and you were an ardent Trumpite, and the president was railing about mail-in ballots, would you decide that not voting is better than standing on line for 2 or 3 hours? How many votes do you think that cost him? Now, he will probably say, these people are loyal to me. They're coming out no matter what happens. But as you saw the results roll in, you saw what happened. Biden was getting votes in batches. Sometimes 80% of a single batch would be for Biden in the mail-in vote. And I really suspect that it was Trump's railing against fraudulent practices that caused the Republican base to not vote by mail. Otherwise, why would the discrepancy be so huge? Now, in many places, the Republicans figured they had a lock. There had never been a Democratic president who got votes from their particular state. But look at what happened in places like Georgia, a state that hadn't voted Democratic in 30 years, came out and voted against Trump. And then, of course, you had Arizona. And why? Because he told the greatest lie of all time. Mail-in ballots are fraudulent, fraudulent, fraudulent. And there's never, ever been a major fraud in mail-in ballots. And now they're suing their ass off to get this overturned because there may have been some mistake, some clerical error, some batch that was mishandled. And why wouldn't that happen when you have 150 million ballots? And then you accuse poll workers of doing damage. Now, the poll workers were not all Democrats. They're Republicans. They're independents. Many people working the polls. And then you had Republican people watching the polls, and you had Democratic people watching the polls. So these frivolous suits are going to go on for months. And I can assure you that they're going to come to nothing. And the only people that are happy about these frivolous suits are the attorneys who are getting paid a lot of money. And as I said the other day, it costs like $60 million to do a recount. And who's paying for that recount? The people who didn't even vote because they went out to their donors. They went out to their Republican base to raise the money for all these recounts and all these suits. You don't think Donald is going to spend any of his billions, his so-called billions, on this event? If he had to pay for this out of his pocket, there would be no suits. There would be nothing going on here. But it's okay to get a free ride on your constituents and your loyal followers. And so I leave you with that this morning, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.